Fundraising is a module developed under the Intercom project, co-financed by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. This module is part of a training program created to foment the participation of young people in social entrepreneurship, linked to the regeneration of common goods, and will focus on the importance of funding and what need to be considered, as well as the options available. At first, we will present a brief explanation on why you should fund your business through the answer of three questions: what, why, and how. Then, you will learn more about the different types of business costs to understand its relation with the finance of your company. The several existing sources of business financing will also be presented in this module, as well as further explained. More, you will understand the possible risks of excessive debt for your business, as well as the different existing financial statements. To finalize, an exercise will be presented to ensure that you absorb the knowledge. Let's start with the first topic: funding my business. What, why, and how. Funding the business is normally synonym of fundraising, which is, in the traditional concept, a process when an individual asks for contributions to individuals, businesses, charitable organizations, governmental bodies, between other sources, that can be in the form of money or other resources. Based on this traditional vision, this process is normally related only to the promotion of a defined cause, often linked to solidarity purposes or to finance activities from non-profit organizations that are related and support a cause as well. These causes can be connected with several situations and types of actions, such as philanthropic groups, religious groups, environmental issues, research organizations, political campaigns, among others. Today, this paradigm shift. Business owners and entrepreneurs are using fundraising to support their own business, aiming to find resources to expand their operations in the case of existing business or to start the new in the case of the entrepreneurs. Regardless of being an entrepreneur or an owner, individuals need money or other type of resources for several reasons: to have capacity to start a new business, to purchase equipment or repair it, to focus and invest on different operations, such as the case of marketing to foment a promotion, increase the capacity of existing areas, or just to have a capital cushion so that it is possible to finance future activities of the business. A business needs money, not only in an initial phase to be created, but also during its development, many times to boost production, sales, or distribution. Some costs, such as renting the facilities, payment of salaries, insurance, for example, when defined, are fixed, but tend to increase as the business grows. It is common that the business doesn't have the capacity to respond to these costs, so the receiving of funds is essential in the phase of expansion also. If you are in the process of deciding if you will turn to a funding option, there are several factors you should have in mind and consider before deciding, such as: When do you need the money? Now or in the near future? What are your needs in terms of short term or long term? How fast do you think you can pay back to the investors or provide a return on investment? What do you need the money for? Is it for operating expenses or for the purchase of potential assets such as equipment or real estate? Do you need all of the total requested now, or it can be delivered in smaller amounts over the next months? Do you intend to assume all the risk in case of bankruptcy of the company, or are you looking for to share the risks? Now, let's talk about the different types of business costs. Do you know which they are? The structural costs of a business differ not only with the type of business, but also depending on the departments and type of activities performed. For instance, a service provider organization will present different structural costs from a manufacturing, as it will be demonstrated after. These differences are reflected in the financial statements since it depends on the product, service, customer, and business activities that take part in the financial report. However, regardless the type of business and activities, the costs can be divided in two categories: fixed and variable. Fixed costs, as the name indicates, don't usually change over time, at least considering a short time. Besides having a predictable amount, these costs are also incurred regularly. Normally, they are reflected in basic operating expenses, such as rent payment, interest expenses, property taxes, depreciation of fixed assets, and direct labor costs, salaries. Of course, there are exceptions on the characteristics presented. For instance, in a company where the salary of the employees are based on variable components, as the case of a seller, in which the income is calculated based on an amount of fixed salary plus a percentage of the sales per month, the direct labor costs can vary significantly, although still be considered fixed costs. Another common example happens when a leasing contract of a building ends and the new conditions have to be discussed. In this case, it is common to be reflected on an increase of the cost of the rent, independent if the business activities increases or decreases. Variable costs have the opposite characteristic of the fixed costs. They vary depending on the levels of production, for instance, or service provided. In this sense, it is expected that, in case the volume of the production is zero, there aren't any services provider, the variable costs are also zero. To better understand this type of expenses, think about the following examples: raw material costs, bonuses and commissions, marketing expenses, and travel costs, as well as costs with consumable used in the production, including materials. When you are planning to create a business, it is very important to understand the cost structure it should have, so that the chance to maximize the profits increases, as well as to ensure that you will create a sustainable business. Firstly, you should know which costs you will incur so that after you know how you can minimize those costs. However, when considering the cost reduction, it is important to define the minimum limit that don't affect the quality of the products or services. Some costs are essential to run the business with quality and responding to the consumer's expectations that shouldn't be deceived. A deep analysis is needed in order not to jeopardize the business activity. Of course, that some costs don't provide additional value to the main business, and those expenses can and should be cut. In case of a business that has a great amount of fixed costs, the volume of sales must be high as well, so that there is a sufficient contribution margin to balance with the fixed costs. When the optimum sales level is reached, it is common that the variable costs per unit are low, which is reflected in the higher profits above the breakdown level. For example, in an oil refinery, this situation occurs due to the high fixed costs related to the refining capacity. Imagine that barrel of oil drops below a certain amount. What do you think it happens? The refinery loses money. However, if the opposite happens, if the price of a barrel of oil increases above a certain level, the company will manage to be very profitable. The same situation happens with a consultancy company, for instance, in which the fixed costs are high, including the salary costs, depending on the number of the workers. In this case, a new service can represent a new hiring, increasing the fixed costs of the enterprise. Please note that the personal costs are fixed, since there are work contracts between company and worker, and the gross salary paid doesn't vary. But extra time worked and paid must be considered as variable costs. Now picture a company that has low fixed costs. The most probable scenario is that it has high variable costs per unit. In case this happens, the company can be profitable even with low volume levels, but the profits don't increase exponentially as the level of sales grow. In case a company is composed by a big part of variable costs, then probably the majority of its expenses will fluctuate in the same portion as the revenues. So, it can have more success than a company that has high fixed costs. Companies with high fixed costs should be more profitable with large sales amounts. Thus, the profit of an enterprise will vary according to the fixed and variable costs and the sales amount. Next, three examples of the cost structures presented before will be described, based on different types of business: a services provider, a manufacturer, and a technological startup. Let's take the cost structure of a service provider as an example. In this case, the cost structure is mainly defined by fixed costs such as wages and benefits, amortization of equipment, taxes, interest, rent, advertising, utilities, insurance, software, education, and computer services that don't fluctuate with the entrance of new clients or the loss of them. The variable costs are only a small portion of the total costs, mainly related to office expenses and travel and business services. Now let's look at another cost structure from a manufacturer. Although the amount of fixed costs are higher than the variable costs as well, its allocation is very different. Normally, a manufacturer has a business based on intensive capital which has, as a consequence, significant amortization costs, being both costs fixed plus taxes, wages and benefits, interest, rent, insurance, repairs and maintenance of information technology that are also part of the business. To these fixed costs, it is necessary to add the variable costs related to materials, parts, transportation, utilities, and licensing fees, for example, reflecting in the form of unit cost per produced item. For last, let's reflect on the cost structure of a technological startup. Since the revenues are small or non existent, normally there aren't any variable costs. All costs are fixed, namely related to R&D expenses, translated in labor costs many times, advertising, taxes, bank fees, computing fees, travel, business services, software, education, rent, and supplies, just to name the most common usage. This structure is related to the fact that in a startup, most times the equipment and software is leased, so there are almost no property behind. Once the company stabilizes and the revenue grows, the cost structure will change and the variable costs will appear. Now that we have learned about the reasons to fund my business and the different types of costs, it's time to talk about the possible sources of business financing. Before continuing with the presentation of the existing sources of business financing, it is important to comprehend that there are two types of business funding: the debt financing and the equity financing. The first type, the debt financing, is related to all situations in which money is borrowed to you and you agree to pay it back in a defined period of time, with a specific interest rate added. So, at the end, you owe the money regardless the success or not of your business. Situation like this happens when you ask for a bank loan, for example. The second type, the equity financing, happens when you sell part of the ownership of your business to an investor in exchange of the money. When this agreement occurs, the investor assumes the risk of being a partner, meaning that, in case the business doesn't succeed, he loses money. On the contrary, if the business succeeds and grows, normally the investor has a higher return on his investment, greater than the typical interest rates. This should compensate the assumed risk. So, in the scenario of success of the company, the equity financing turns to be a more expensive option, but in case of the business fails, this option is the less expensive. But let's continue to learn more about these two types of business financing. Debt isn't very appealing in general, since it means that you are owing money to someone. However, it is very common among entrepreneurs and small business owners. In the normal definition, debt financing means, as seen before, that you borrow money and you are obligated to repay it inside a defined period of time with interests. This definition is not static. It can present differences depending on the lender. Nevertheless, there are a few characteristics that are usually common. In short-term loans, the payments are made in less than a year. In long-term loans, the payments can exceed the period of 1 year. The ownership remains fully with the owner of the business. The lender is just a creditor. The obligation of the debtor is only to repay the loan. In the first phase of a business, normally the loan is asked for personal guarantee of the entrepreneur. This means that the debt financing, in this case, is a personal debt financing. This is an important aspect to have in mind when asking for a loan. If you don't want to repay the loan or you think it's too risky, you can choose the equity financing option, in which you exchange the money need for a part of the ownership of your business, meaning that you don't need to incur on a debt and become a debtor to obtain funds for your business. Although these positive aspects, there are three main costs, even that's non-monetary, that we'll have to incur. You will see your ownership interests or profits reduced. You can lose power in the process of decision making in case the investor wants to participate in the business decisions. With the entrance of a new partly owner, the culture of your business can suffer changes, as well as its identity. Before deciding, measure the pros and cons of asking for equity financing and compare them with the ones from the debt financing. Of course that you don't have to strict to just one option. You can have debt and equity financing as long as your ratio is acceptable. In case you intend to ask for funds from different sources or in separated moments of time, it is important to ensure that the options are analyzed so that you can ask for one financing that protects your ratio. So, if you need to use more than one option of financing or in different moments, you should know that in case you present an oversized debt financing, your credit rating becomes weak, which can have as a consequence a fragility on your capacity to raise money. If you have too much debt, your business can be considered a risky investment. Again, if you have too much debt, it is normal that the interest rates increase when you ask for a new loan, which can be prejudicial to your business. Due to the limitations of the debt financing described before, many entrepreneurs prefer to focus on the efforts on the equity financing, aiming to generate capital. However, as this is still a financing option, it presents constraints that should be considered in a moment of decision, such as analyzing if the capital is being used in the most productive way. Assure that the business capital is being correctly used, namely as a leverage to obtain more money. If you have little equity in your business, this can be interpreted as lack of interest on it. Investors tend to show a position and want to be involved in the decisions, which can interfere with what you had planned. Lenders will analyze your debt to equity ratio when you ask for a loan to check if you have a risky business and the credit rating is acceptable. Namely, if you go to a local bank, the ratio considered will be between 1 to 2 and one-to-one. Now that you understood the differences between the debt and equity financing, let's explore the possible options of fundraising. Next, we will consider 9 possibilities: personal investment, love money, credit cards, venture capital, business angels, crowdfunding, business incubators, government grants and subsidies, and bank loans. Let's talk about personal investment. Normally, when you decide to start a business, you shouldn't depend on others. You should be the first investor, using your own cash or your assets as a guarantee. This effort will later be seen as a long term commitment to future investors and bankers, since you took the first risk by yourself, which shows confidence in your business. However, if the investment is not made properly, you can take an unnecessary risk. It's important to track the expenditures since the beginning. You should always account your money on your business books so that an accurate tracking path is ensured in order to know how much your business owes and to whom, for example. You should keep the booking as a debt or an equity, but always book it. Nevertheless, have in mind that the consequences of the two are different. If you book it as an equity, it means that your business don't owe you money to anyone, while if you book it as a debt, you owe money to someone. The second source of funding is love money. What is this? This is money loaned by someone close to you, such as a spouse, parents, family, or friends. This type of cash is considered patient capital by the investors and bankers because it is money that will be paid back once the business profits increases, which can take a while. Since this is money borrowed between two close parties, the terms of the agreement are based on their relationship instead of a risk analysis, which is positive for the entrepreneur. Normally, there aren't fixed payment terms. However, when you accept love money, you should have the following points in mind. Family and friends don't usually have much money to invest. It is possible that they want an equity in the business, but normally it is seen as a regular loan. Business relationship that is being built shouldn't be taken lightly. Credit cards, the third source of business financing, are a well known tool to boost cash flow management, but only in case you don't use it to long term financing of your business necessities. It is important to search for the different offers on credit cards so that you choose the best option available in the market, in which you can, for instance, pay back with no interest associated in the defined period, and, in case you can't pay on that deadline, the introductory rates are low. With a good management associated, credit cards can be a very important tool to balance payments that allows you to have a 30 to 60 days float with no interest. Nevertheless, if managed poorly, they can be extremely expensive. Venture capitals are the fourth source presented here. This is a financing source in which investors lend money and or expertise to startups and small business that have a high potential to growth, in their opinion. This source is many times linked to wealthy investors, for instance, but there is a possibility to be connected to share of expertise and technical knowledge. Venture capitals are looking to invest in businesses linked to technology and high potential to growth. Of course, there are exceptions, but normally their focus is on companies that work on information technology, communications, and biotechnology sectors. Once the investment is made, the investors gain a part of the equity position of the company to compensate the risk they are taking. This means that you lose part of the ownership of your business. In return, they are expecting high profits that many times only happen when the business starts selling their shares to the public. Thus, it is important to carefully choose your investors. The money is not the only factor you should have in consideration, but also their expertise and experience in the sector, increasing their probabilities to success. Venture capitals are becoming more popular as a funding option, especially in the cases in which the access to capital markets and bank loans, for example, is difficult. Business angels are individuals with monetary power due to their wealthy that invest directly in startups or small businesses. They are normally known and important in their field and have the capacity to combine the money with a big network of contacts that are shared, as well as their expertise in technical background or in the management approach. Typically, business angels finance only businesses in the early stage with investments in order of 25,000 euros to 100,000 euros. This is one of the big differences to venture capitals, who invest larger quantities of money in order of 1 million euros. Another difference is related to the place where the money comes from. While business angels invest their own money, venture capitalists invest other people's money. Due to this factor, business angels tend to present more of a low profile in comparison with the venture capitals. Although they still supervise the business and be part of the decisions since they are taking a risk for the company, their participation tends to be more silent in their position. Crowdfunding is a sixth source of business funding presented in which a high number of individuals contribute with small amounts of money to finance a new business or idea through an online platform. Hence, a large number of individuals have access to this opportunity and can spread it through their network, bringing closer investors and entrepreneurs in one place. As a consequence, the investment can be based on small contributions from many individuals, which can result in a large amount. In this case, the term contributors is more used to define individuals instead of investors. The contributions can be essential of one of three options: donations, investments with a return associated, or prepayment of a product or service. There are several platforms available to crowdfund, but some of them are linked to specific types of products, for instance, or have different fees associated. Thus, it is advisable to search for the options and choose the one best suitable for your business. The seventh source are business incubators or accelerators that support businesses linked to high tech areas in their initial phase, mainly. Less likely, but also existent, are incubators linked to local economic development, which operate in areas like job creation or revitalization, for instance. The programs behind these organizations are many times sponsored by other institutions, either public or private. Academic institutions also play an important role in the support of incubators, offering not only financial support but also technical services. Incubators are a very good opportunity to access to services and infrastructures at a low price. Companies that are part of incubators can use their premises as well as resources, whether administrative, logistical, or technical. Normally, this phase takes up to 2 years until the product is ready. Once this occurs, the business usually leaves the incubator premises and enters in the market in force. Naturally, there are hundreds of incubators and their specialization differs, as well as the service offered and the prices charged. Thus, it is important to search and choose the one most suitable for our business needs. If you are developing a product that needs to be tested on a lab, it is essential that you choose one that has a lab in their premises, for example. Government grants and subsidies are also an important source to consider for funding your business, although these differ between countries and in some cases between regions. A government grant is an award given to a grantee by the federal, state, or local government that usually don't require payment back, but also don't include technical and financial support. In some options, you will have to invest the same amount as you are asking. In other cases, when the grant is reimbursed, it is possible that this financing has no interest rates and represents a larger grace period. The business funded are normally linked with I&D, innovative products process, public services, or that stimulate and have an important impact on the economy, being also projects that address key priorities or needs defined by sectors. The process of grant awarding is difficult. The proposal has to go through public procurement actions and compete with other projects based on several strict criteria. To present your idea, you must develop a detailed project description, including the benefits of a project for your business and for the society, the whole work plan and costs associated, the experience and expertise that your human resources have to implement the project, just as a few examples. In the application form that is normally used, you will be asked to justify your project significance, approach, and innovation, as well as the need for the grant. The last source of funding your business are bank loans, a well-known option that is widely used by businesses that already have some stability, which is not the case of startups usually. The main reason behind this is based on the fact that to receive a loan, normally banks search for a strong sound track record and credit rating, as well as high probability to pay it back, based on their capacity. The idea behind the business is not enough, so a strong business plan has to be presented. Due to the risks associated, normally banks ask for a personal guarantee from the entrepreneurs. The loans offered by a bank can have a micro dimension for only a few hundred of euros to huge dimension of millions of euros. Despite the amounts, a loan is based on a payment back basis plus interest rates or other type of financial charges. The typical loans are the ones that you ask for a specific amount. More, there is also an option of credit type of loans, in which there is a credit line available to be used until a specific amount. In this case, the interest only starts to be paid once the money is actually spent. Different banks offer different options and present specific service, as well as customized repayment options. Hence, it is important to find the bank that responds to your needs with the most interest answers. Now, we will learn about the risks that your business can undertake if it has an excessive debt. If the debt amount of your business is high, serious risks can be followed. It's important to ask for loans to raise capital, and it's an important source of financing. But too much debt has serious consequences, not only in short term, but also in long term. Having a balance between debt capital and equity investing is the best option and the one that has as a consequence less burdens for your business, in principle. Hence, several possible risks should be considered, such as bankruptcy, limited flexibility, and poor profits. If the debt situation is extreme, in which you can't repay the loans, your business can face a bankruptcy situation. Moreover, if your business structure is a sole proprietorship, the finances of your business aren't separated from yours, which means that there is a possibility that you could face a personal bankruptcy as well. Thus, your business ends, or at least has to change ownership. In this situation, if you have assets, normally they are seized so that the creditors can recover at least part of the money. Related to the limited flexibility, in case of a high debt leverage, the consequences are less dramatic, but also important to be considered. In this case, since you are more likely to pay late or even not to pay, your business becomes unattractive for the lenders, which means that the process of finding creditors becomes more complicated. It is very likely that the interest rates increase and even negative answers from investors are received. The high debt leverage mentioned before has also impact on the business profitability, since you have to count with high amounts of payments monthly. Hence, even with enough revenue, the profits become more difficult to reach. Moreover, if the debt extends in time, it is very likely that the interest rates increase. If you don't have profit and can't appeal to new funding, the growth expectation becomes hard to turn into reality. If you want to avoid the scenarios described before, you should define a debt to ratio equity. Despite the risks mentioned, debt is an important tool for business growth, but it must be used properly, since the consequences can be the opposite of the intending. The debt to equity ratio, as presented early in this module, represents the portion of equity and debt that are used to acquire and maintain the business assets, as well as the probability that the shareholders' equity can pay the business obligations in case of bankruptcy. In other words, if a business has a low debt to equity ratio, this means that the amount of financing via debt is lower than the amount of funding through equity. And if it has a high debt to ratio, the financing is coming mostly from lenders, which can be an indicator for high debts. The right amount of debt to equity ratio depends on the sector. You should compare your ratio with the average in your sector, and if the number is bigger, that means your ratio is too high. As an example, if your business possesses 250 euros in liabilities and 200 euros in shareholders' equity, your debt to equity ratio is 1.55, meaning that for each 1 euro in equity, you use 1.55 euros in debt. Or, in other words, your debt level is 155% of your equity. The main problem occurs if the average of your sector is 0.5. In this case, you have a high debt to equity ratio. Before moving to the practical exercise, let's discuss one last topic: financial statements. Do you know what financial statements are? Are you familiar with this term? Financial statements are business records in a written form that compile all the financial activities and conditions of your business. They should present the financial information in a clear and concise form, if possible, to facilitate the reading and understanding by the business owners and by the readers. There are several types of financial statements, such as income statements, balance sheets, statements of retained earnings, and cash flow statements. However, depending on the needs, some extra information not presented here can be required for accounting purpose. In this part of the module, we will focus on three financial statements: balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement. The balance sheet is a statement developed usually at the end of the year that provides an overview of the assets, liability, and stockholders' equity at that moment. The basis of the balance sheet is related to the well-known equation, that is, assets equal to liabilities plus stockholders' equity. This equation must be correct, otherwise the balance sheet has to be revised. In other words, the assets detained by an entity can be funded by one of two ways: through liabilities, such as debt, or by stockholders' equity, expressed by the retaining earnings and additional paid in terms of capital. However, while the assets are referred as current liquidity, the liabilities are expressed in terms of debt to be paid, divided by short-term liabilities to be paid in that year or long-term liabilities to be paid for more than a year. There are four main characteristics that define a balance sheet: display the financial position of the entity, represents a time frame of the business in a given moment, is composed by three parts: assets, liabilities, and stockholders' equity, must be in line with the equation assets equal to liabilities plus stockholders' equity. In summary, the financial statement provides a snapshot of what a company owns and owns, as well as the shareholders' investments. The income statement can cover the period of 1 year, if it is an annual financial statement of the period, or 3 months, if it is a quarterly financial statement. This document presents an overview of the revenues, expenses, net income, and earnings per share. Normally, income statements have also data from 2 or 3 years for comparison purpose. Usually, this document is the first one that receives attention from the investor, aiming to perceive how the business is doing in terms of performance. In terms of layout, the income statement presents the revenue on the top, and then its deductions related to the costs of the product sold to achieve the gross profit. Then, to the gross profit, it is deducted the operating expenses and income to reach the net income represented at the bottom. The operating expenses and income depend on the nature of the business, so here several types of amounts can be inserted. The income statement is defined by four main characteristics: displays the revenues and expenses of the business, the amounts are related to a specific period of time, is a tool to measure the business profitability. The final one, the cash flow statement, is a combination of the balance sheet and income statement and merges both in three main business activities. The first one is the operating activities, which includes the cash flows that result from the regular business operations. The second one is related to the investing activities and is presented by the cash flows related to the purchase and sales of the business assets. The third one is the financial activities related to the cash flows resulting from the debt and equity investment capital. Hence, the cash flow statement presents the four main characteristics. The increase and decrease of cash is represented. It is defined in a specific period of time. The accounting principles disappear in order to show only the cash movements. Display the net change related to the cash balance since the beginning of the defined period to the end. Three types of financial statements were presented and explained before: the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flow statement. Regarding the moment in time, the balance sheet presents a specific point in time, while the income and the cash flow statements show the result from a period of time. Each one of them has its own purpose. The first one aims to define the financial position of the business, while the second one shows the profitability and the third one the real cash movements. The measures used are also different. The balance sheets include assets, liabilities, and capital equity mainly. The income statement is presented in terms of revenues, expenses, and profitability. The cash flow statement only shows the increase and decreases in cash. All of these financial statements have different starting and ending points. The balance sheet starts by presenting the cash balance and the final result in presented related to the retained earnings. The income statement starting point is the business revenue, and after the movements included, it finishes in the presentation of the net income. For last, the cash flow statement starts by showing the net income, and the final step is the calculation of the net balance. Here you have an example of the three. Take a few minutes to understand the connection between them. Now, let's take some time for an exercise about some topics we learned in this module. Ready? Imagine that you own a factory in which the main business is to produce personalized coffee mugs. However, you would like to be more aware of the profit, so you decided to analyze the profitability. Thus, you will need to collect all the necessary data about the costs, fixed and variable, and the income. In order to help, we included some assumptions. So, first of all, you should assume some numbers. The monthly rent is 1000 euros. The electricity is 200 euros per month and the water is 100 euros per month. Each mug costs 3 euros to produce, which are the manufacturing costs. The staff costs are 9,700 per month, which includes the costs with the people who work in the factory. The selling price of each mug is 5 euros, assuming that the margin is all for you. Now that we defined the needed assumptions, you will answer to the following questions. Firstly, define how much you spend with fixed costs per month. Then, after responding to the previous question and assuming that you sell all the mugs you produced in 1 year, which are around 60,000, calculate the total amount of costs per month and decide if you have profit or not. Next, assume that you increase the production in 20% and you sell all the mugs produced, including the extra. Within this in mind, calculate the total amount of costs per month and, once again, decide if with these changes you have profit. Regarding the question 1 and 2, here are the solutions. In question 1, you were asked to calculate the fixed costs per month. From what you have learned before, fixed costs are the ones that normally have a predictable amount and that are also incurred regularly. Hence, in this exercise, this type of costs are the rent, the electricity and water bills, and the staff costs. The manufacturing costs are variable, since they depend on the production. Hence, the amount of fixed costs is 11,000 euros per month. To calculate the amount of costs per month, which is requested in the second question, you need to add the variable costs. As the amounts are being defined per month, and you only have the annual number of mugs produced, you have to divide it by 12 months. Then, to that value, which is the number of mugs produced per month, you have to multiply it for the cost of producing each mug, which is 3 euros. The amount of variable costs per month is 15,000 euros. Hence, the total amount of costs per month is the sum of the two, which results in 26,000 euros. The third question was about the profitability of the business. At this point, you have the amount of the total cost calculated, but you don't have the revenues, which you need. To discover this number, you need the number of mugs sold per month and how much you receive for each mug. In question 2, you discover that you sell 5,000 mugs per month. In the assumptions presented in the beginning, it said that each mug is sold by 5 euros. Based on this amount, the total revenue is 25,000 euros. However, the total costs are 26,000 euros, which are higher. So, the business isn't profitable, since it is losing 1,000 euros per month. To calculate the gross margin, you can deduct the manufacturing cost to the price, and, in this case, this value is 2 euros per mug. It's important to note that this margin only considers the variable costs. So, even if you have a positive margin, you may have loss. In this exercise, the margin per mug isn't necessary, but it's always important to know how to calculate for future needs. Let's continue to the last two questions. To respond to these ones, you must assume that your production increased 20% and all of it was sold, including the extra. Based on these facts, you were asked to calculate the total amount of costs per month. Firstly, from the first question, we defined that the amount of fixed costs was 11,000 euros, and since they are fixed, they don't change with increased production. Nevertheless, you have to calculate the new number of mugs sold per month, which is 5,000 mugs you produced before, plus 20% of this number, giving a total of 5,000 mugs per month. The variable cost of mug maintains, but the total amount changes, and is now 18,000 euros. So, the total costs are 29,000 euros. The price of each mug also maintains, but the total revenue increases, due to the higher number of mugs sold. In this case, the total revenue is 30,000 euros. Hence, there is a profit of 1,000 euros in this case. This is a graphic that summarizes the exercise before. The fixed costs maintain despite the number of mugs sold, but with the increase of 1,000 mugs, the variable costs also increase, but in a lower amount of the revenues, which results in a change in the profitability from a non-profitable business to a profitable business. Fundraising and financing sources module is now finished. Thank you for your attention and participation. Don't forget to continue to the next modules to learn more about other interesting topics. Good luck!